Hello, and welcome to Candidates Up Front. This is the public interest election program of Berks Community Television and the League of Women Voters of Berks County. I'm Judith Cranus, a member of the League. Our November 5th general election is coming up, and we will be voting for both state officials and federal officials. The deadline to register is Monday, October 21st. The League is interviewing candidates in contested races, those who wanted to be interviewed. And for each race, the candidates will get the same basic questions and will have the same amount of time to answer them.
Two candidates are competing in the 6th Congressional District, Democrat Chrissy Houlihan and Republican Neil Young. The district is in the southern section of Berks County, stretching from Carnarvon Township through Exeter, the city of Reading, Wyomissing, and Spring Township, and south to New Morgan. It also includes all of Chester County. The U.S. House of Representatives proposes and passes federal laws which must also be approved by the U.S. Senate. They act on domestic and international issues. They serve 2-year terms and earn $174,000 per year plus benefits and expenses. Please note that the opinions expressed in this interview are those of the candidate and are not the opinions of the League of Women Voters or Berks Community Television. This interview is with Neil Young. He is the challenger. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Mr. Young, please tell our viewers about yourself and why you are running.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank the League of Women Voters for having me. I'd like to thank BCTV for doing. I mean, this is an important forum. And so I appreciate that. But so, like I said, you said my name's Neil Young. I'm a public school social studies teacher. I've been teaching civics and government for 22 years in the Great Valley School District. And, I live in East Nate Mill Township, which is in the northwest corner of Chester County. I live in this old 300-year-old farmhouse that we love. And I've got 4 kids. My 2 oldest boys are in college. One's in trade school, Williamson College of Trades, and my 2 youngest are at High Point Baptist Academy, where my wife is an art teacher. And, so that's a little bit of who I am. I'm a lifelong resident of Chester County. I'm deeply, deeply committed and rooted in my, in my community, in my church, in my, just all over, on the sports teams. I coach, I do all kinds of stuff like that. But as far as running goes, I think there's a lot of different reasons. Everybody's a little bit divided on why they do it. There's a sort of a myriad of reasons. But wanting to inspire the next generation that regardless of where you are on the political aisle, this is our government. And if we don't treat it as such, if we leave sort of that burden to everybody else, we're going to get the same answers. And so I want to inspire. I know that not very 1% of the population considers running for office, and so I really I want to inspire that next generation to really rise up and not depend on somebody else to answer those, but maybe they've got the answers that our country needs.
What are the 2 most compelling issues on which, if elected, you feel you can make a difference?
Okay. Again, as a lifelong educator, I think the need, we've got to do better in education, okay? And there's a lot of different sort of models and answers to that. And there's a lot of different levels of government to that, too. There's local, there's state, and there's federal answers to it. But I think that we are, just as a nation, we've never invested more in terms of finances, and we've never gotten less of a return. So I really, really believe strongly that there are better solutions out there, and I think oftentimes they're driven by actually the teachers who are in the trenches every day. So that's a big, that's a big driving force. And then really, the other one that I would, that I see is, inflation is killing everybody. I'm a father of 4, and there are certainly federal policies that I believe are driving some of these inflationary times that we're living in. So these are the things that I think are on America's sort of mind, and they're on my mind as well.
Okay, what do you see as the 3 most crucial issues facing Congress in the next term?
So the 3 most crucial. I mean, in some ways you defer to the American people, right? Because I'm a representative of the American people, and so when you look at the vast majority of polling, you would go with immigration, inflation, energy, healthcare. These are the issues that I would, I put education up there as well. That's sort of my wheelhouse and my skill set, my expertise. But the truth of the matter is, finding that balance between really advocating for why I ran and what I believe, and balancing it with, but I'm here to represent 700,000 people. figuring out how to do that best. So those are the things that I think the American people want better answers to.
What is your philosophy on the responsibility of the United States in international issues? If the continuum is isolationism to involvement, where do you place yourself? Does it differ from issue to issue? And give us some background on that.
Right. So it certainly, I would certainly say there's nuance and it differs from issue to issue. I've had the sort of, I've been fortunate. I've traveled the world a little bit in the name of education. Actually, I've been to Afghanistan 3 times, and in part to engage with a failing and underserved school system in Afghanistan. I've also been to East Africa, and so there are varying levels of government involvement. So when the first time I went to Afghanistan in 2007, one of the things, without U.S. military involvement there, I think the beauty that the United States does when they go in and they, whether we wanted them in Afghanistan or to engage or not, we always do everything we can to leave this place a better place than we found it. And I can tell you honestly, over the course of 7 years off and on, seeing there was progress that was being made, and there was progress that was lost when we withdrew. And so I think we need to be very, very. We need to calculate when we get involved internationally. Certainly, we've got too much to offer to be isolationist, but we also can't be the world's policeman. And so prioritizing who our foreign allies are, and that would be the allies that share, our national Judeo-Christian values, prioritizing our allies and then determining what does it look like to come alongside them, what does it look like for the rest of the international community to engage in them as well. That's sort of the nuance of foreign policy.
Okay. And give us your thoughts on how the United States should interact with China and Taiwan, with Russia and Ukraine, and Israel and Gaza.
Right. So these are pretty traditional hotspots around the globe when you look at them. And if I'm being more specific, there's a fragility to that China-Taiwan relationship. Obviously, you have and the same can be said about the Russia-Ukraine too. You've got an enormous nuclear power that's really could have its way with these foreign sort of enemies, neighbors, whatever you refer them to, and so we've got to be really, really cognizant of ensuring that we don't tip the scales and set off a nuclear chain of events. It's why I firmly believe that the stronger America is, not just militarily but economically, the stronger that America is, the safer the world is. And I think that can sort of be we can look at various times throughout history. A strong America has always led to a more peaceful world, and so that's with that. As far as Russia, Ukraine, we've got to every opportunity. There's always opportunity costs with how we spend our time and our money and our resources. And so while Ukraine is, it's a worthy cause, they're fighting for their very existence. It doesn't mean that we can't co-opt or incorporate, European allies to help share the burden and load. And with Israel, Israel's unique in that Israel's the only nation, in the world that is surrounded by enemies that want to see it no longer exist. And so Israel has a very, very challenging, they've got a challenging mission, and that is. They have to keep themselves safe, and we have got to support the nation of Israel in their fight, against terrorism.
Switching topics a bit,
Sure.
Both parties say they are pro-family, but they propose and vote for very different things. What legislation do you feel is pro-family?
I think both parties say they're pro-family because they are both pro-family. I think that's intrinsic sort of human nature. We're drawn to family and to care for family, and so I genuinely believe that. But sure, we go about that different ways. Pro-family, to me, pro-family legislation looks like being able to afford a family. So I would say battling deficit spending and massive spending packages in order to bring down the cost of inflation and all the basic things that it takes to raise a family. Your grocery bills, your gas, and all the other things that are important. As far as incentivizing we're, I've heard a lot of experts say we're below the replacement rate in terms of, birth rates in this country. And so, we can, there's ways to incentivize. That's a pro-family, to me, that's a pro-family legislation. Back in I guess it had to be somewhere around 2018, 19, 20, when the tax code was simplified, we did away with an adoption tax credit that was $13,000. My family, we adopted our son from Ethiopia in 2011, and we benefited from a $13,000 tax credit. And the vast majority of adopting families are middle-class families. And sometimes the difference between, a government sort of, a government credit of $13,000, that's the difference between adopting and not. So these are the pro-family sort of policies that I think the government can advocate for.
Okay, and paid parental leave, any thoughts there?
Paid parental leave. I mean, that's one of those things. It's challenging. As far as government worker type, issue, I think in order to have, sure, there's got to be, to a large degree, we've got to be able to bring about some equity between males and females in the workplace, and be able to say, you know what, there's 12 weeks, or I'm sure we can, there's always a negotiation or room to wiggle in between that. But I think as far as, that paid leave for private sector employees, really, I think that should be something that can be used in the private sector to incentivize, a workforce that comes in and says, hey, you want to work here? Here's a compensation package that we offer.
Sure.
There's a lot of different ways that I think really good corporations can incentivize workers to come in and work for their organization.
Okay. What is the place of religion in politics, in education, and in government?
Neither establish nor deny, right? Like it's it's right there in the First Amendment. The role is to ensure, and this is a tightrope, right? The role is to ensure that the government neither establishes nor prohibits the free exercise thereof. And sometimes those, they butt up against each other, and there's competing interests. And and so I think, this would probably be more subjective and opinion based, but I think we've seen, the pendulum swing towards more of a, there's some, the Christians as a community globally are the most persecuted group in the world. And so, I would certainly stop short of saying there's persecution here. There's certainly instances of intolerance for a lot of different religions, but compared to the vast majority of the world, we have it pretty good. And so, I think it's important that we respect the rights of those First Amendment rights of those who want to engage in the free exercise, and respect the rights of those who want secular education.
Sure. The ease of registering to vote, the ease of casting our ballot, and the power of our vote due to gerrymandering, those things change when we move from state to state. As critical as the vote is to the American concept of democracy, should there be federal standards that protect our vote no matter where we live? And please tell us why you support or don't support the Freedom to Vote and John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Okay, so, there already are some federal guidelines, post-Civil War federal, amendments that aim to do just that, in terms of, ensuring that there's no, ensuring that there's not discrimination with the right to vote. Now, the difference between obviously codifying it in law and then the actual, ensuring that there's actual, there's not voter intimidation, there's not, you're not watering down anybody's voice, you're not, you're ensuring to the best degree possible that everybody's voice has equal weight in the vote. And so in terms of in terms of making sure that somehow, again, if you look at this as a spectrum, the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's every state can run things differently, which to a large degree is the way it works now. Too, we have a federal government who's running, because these are quote federal elections, a federal government running those. Well, I would err on the side of let the states. To me, that's a 10th Amendment issue, right? Let the states determine how they're going to best ensure that every vote is counted, and every person eligible, they make it easy for them to vote, but also, ensure that nobody's vote is watered down by those who those who shouldn't be voting. And so I would err on that side versus, to a greater degree of federal takeover of our elections.
Okay. Gun violence costs the U.S. $557 billion annually. That includes outfitting and training first responders against new and improved weapons, retrofitting buildings to add security, and healthcare. 96% of gun violence-related healthcare is shouldered by Medicare and U.S. employers through health insurance plans. Gun violence is an inflationary economic pressure. Should Congress act on this issue? And if so, what do you feel Congress should or could do to decrease the cost of gun violence?
That's an interesting question. My little sister's a nurse in North Philly and deals with, she spends a whole lot of time dealing with gunshot wounds. And I will tell you that there's not a quick, easy solution to this, to the idea of gun violence. To some degree, I don't want to say I reject the premise because I respect the numbers, but we don't have the flip side of it, and that is, if we're talking about limiting, the rights of gun owners, we could say it costs this much, but I've read a variety of different, reports that would say for every life taken by a gun, 2 lives are saved. I don't know how you quantify this type of thing, but there's a really, really good possibility that the Second Amendment saves us. Let's say all of a sudden we say, Congress with a stroke of a pen, we can really, really bring down the cost of gun violence. We don't know to what are some of the ancillary effects of that, and also that's any type of legislation like that becomes very, very challenging. And so I generally go on the premise of this, and that is and I'll direct this right back to schools where because it's a really big issue in schools these days. The single biggest thing to prevent mass shootings is response time by those in charge, response time by first responders, law enforcement. And so the ability to have an armed security guard in every school, I believe strongly, and again, somebody who spent 22 years in school, I believe that will, it's not going to cure them, but that's going to be our best hope.
Recently, Congress, which hasn't updated immigration law since 1986, negotiated a new plan that people in both parties said was acceptable. At the last minute, it did not pass. In your mind, what does an immigration law need to contain for you to vote for it?
Great question. The immigration law that it was bipartisan. There were both sides of it. That was towards the end of this congressional session. At the very beginning of the congressional session, House Bill 2, from my perspective, and I think from a lot of the American people's perspective, it was a much stronger bill on the border. That's the one that dealt with ensuring that asylum seekers report at port of entries, ensuring things like E-Verify for employers, making sure that we increase border patrol numbers, that we re-engaged with building a wall. The second part of legislation that Congress, both the House and the Senate, were debating on had one of the things that can't be in it. To me, it's a non-starter. We cannot negotiate human life as it relates to opening and closing the border. So we can't say X number of people are allowed to cross the border in a given period of time, and then our border measures are going to kick in. And so that would be, I would say, a non-starter would be the idea that once 5,000 hit, now we're going to get serious about the border. We have to have consistent border security, and we've got to come to a place where we can all agree that without safe and secure borders, nobody in a nation of immigrants, nobody can really fully function if we don't have secure borders.
Wildfires, storms, and floods are expensive emergencies to deal with. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, ran out of disaster relief funding in the middle of the hurricane season. In the middle of the hurricane season. In 2024, Congress allocated nearly $200 million for pre-disaster mitigation projects to lessen the impact of emergencies. Should the U.S. spend more on mitigation, including climate change mitigation? So we need to spend less on disasters and disaster relief.
I think first we have to come to a little bit greater consensus with to what degree the changing climate is impacting natural disasters, and what are the other factors that might be contributing. Like, for example, we've got drought in the southwestern part of the United States, and we have it pretty consistently. And I think we would expect to have drought in a desert area. And so, are there other measures that state, local, and federal government can institute in order to reduce that? Can we, are there, they haven't dammed a river or created an aquifer in the southwest part of the United States in a long time. These are the kind of things. Same with when you look at wildfires. Southern California is ravaged with wildfires, and to some degree that it's been that way. But as it's increasing, we have to look at not just temperature, but we have to look at what are some of the state and local policies. Are we clearing? Are they doing a proper job of clearing brush? Are those wildfires in that mountainous region? Do they exist? Is that happening in Canada? Is that happening in Mexico? What are they doing, to fight these things? I think before we allocate the American people's hard-earned dollars, we owe it to them to make sure that we drill down to the real root cause. Because if we don't drill to the root cause, then all we're doing is throwing money at a problem, and it may not be the solution. I want to solve problems, but I want to solve them with the correct answers that are informed by science and informed by the experts.
Because we have so many climate-related disasters, the cost of flood, homeowners, and health insurance has increased. Should Congress play a role in addressing this? And if so, what role should Congress play?
So, I mean, when you're talking about things like, owning homes and building homes in floodplains and insuring those homes, the federal government is already the largest insurer of those homes. How do we fight? How do we fight those type of premiums? Well, I think in those states, you even see it. There are states that are more business friendly and states that are less. And so if we can get more competition into the areas in those states that where people who need flood, fire, disaster relief insurance, where they can pick and choose, those rates are going to come down. You've seen rates in California, just basic insurance rates going up because you've got insurance companies fleeing the state because, there's business practices that are not, government practices that they're not business friendly. And so these are decisions that businesses are making that the cost of doing business there is just too high. So I think creating a more business friendly climate and environment is going to help with that.
Okay. Our nation has more and more people living on the street because the U.S. doesn't have enough affordable housing. Is this something for Congress to address, or should it be left to the states? And if it comes up in Congress, what needs to be in the program for you to vote for it? So
this, the truth of the matter is, so many of the issues and challenges that we're facing, whether it's affordable housing, inflation, go back to some really simple root causes. We can't flood our border with immigrants. We can't bring in whatever the number is, 10, 12 million people over the course of the last 3 years. It's unprecedented. We can't bring that number of people in who are number one competing in every way, shape, and form, but are also heavily relying on government services, and then competing for housing. And so the housing market can't keep up with this type of migration. So the very first thing that has to happen is we've got to ensure that we secure our border. As that happens, the cost of housing is unaffordable everywhere, but the cost of housing will come down. When that cost of housing comes down, those building and development issues can be, by and large, handled at a state and local level.
Two of our Berks County League members have been working for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment for more than 50 years each. So we have to ask this question. Do you believe that, as the amendment states, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex? Do you believe that belongs in the U.S. Constitution?
I think if the American people, by the count of 2/3, believe that it's in I love the process. I love the high threshold of altering our founding documents. That's again, that's what defines us as a republic, right? We don't. It's not a majority rule. It's the rule of law. And so I love the idea that if enough people get behind this, and I get this, there's only half of the people are women. Well, that's okay, because there are that's to assume that every man is not going to vote against that, right? And this is the case, with the women's suffrage movement. You had women on both sides of this issue. The reality of it is this isn't split on gender lines. If 2/3 of the states or if 2/3 of both houses say it is, and if it comes before me, without a doubt, the idea that that all rights should be equal in terms of sex under the law, absolutely.
Okay. Companies donate unregulated dollars to political causes as a form of protected free speech. The public cannot see those donations. Do you think these large corporate campaign contributions influence votes? Should we have more strict campaign finance laws?
So again, this is my first time running. I'm wide-eyed and I'm learning a whole lot. I've got a great treasurer who's helping me out, and I'm learning a lot about campaign finance. I think if you were to say what's one of the most unifying issues in this country, there's way too much money spent on politics, right? And now it's easy for me to say I'm an underdog running against a well-funded incumbent. And there's money coming from everywhere. But here's what I can tell you. I long for the day that candidates sit here and say, here's how wisely I spent your money on the campaign trail, versus look at how much money I raised. That somehow validates me as a candidate. Mm-hmm. To me, that is particularly in the House, right? In the House of Representatives, their job is to pass budgetary, a federal budget. So let's prove that they can, let them prove that they can actually budget the money and not just indiscriminately raise money. I mean, raising money in the midst of these inflationary times is challenging. So yes, I think reform is needed at a state level as well.
The two major parties seem to have very different views on the impact of both tariffs and taxes. Can you share your views on that?
Right, and so I guess this kind of goes back to even a little bit foreign policy. Where's the spectrum of isolationism, versus sort of a global market, a global economy, and we need to. I hear the former president of the United States talking, in strong terms about making sure that, number one, we have greater control over supply chain. Okay, I think if COVID taught everybody one thing, it's that the importance of making sure that we have a high degree of control over our supply chain. And then what do we do with nations that are out there? There are bad actors out there. And so what do we do with a nation like China that manipulates our currency and really we don't, we're really getting fleeced in terms of, what it looks like for trade deficit there. So we've got to ensure we have to be an economy that's diverse. So we've got to have, we've got to bring back a large degree of manufacturing jobs. We're not a nation, no nation really can survive with lack of manufacturing. And so we've got to bring back a diversity of jobs. We've got to ensure that American energy drives the prosperity like it has in all of our history. And we've got to find the balance. If bad actors are going to act bad, then economic sanctions can be a powerful, powerful shaper of behavior.
Founding Father Alexander Hamilton fought for and set up the Federal Reserve Bank to set monetary policy. It's not in the Constitution, but it's a driving force in handling inflation. Since Congress and the President it's not a problem that Congress or the President can solve, but should Congress consider inflationary or deflationary aspects of bills it considers, and if so, how far ahead?
Without a doubt, Congress should not just, to the degree that our government spends money, the underlying assumption is we're not producing as a government. So the underlying assumption is it's going to some degree create inflation. And so is that inflation going to surpass cost of living? Is it going to surpass wage earnings? That's a bigger question. But we should always walk into every piece of legislation knowing and understanding that we are spending money that's not ours. We are spending money that's been allocated to us by the American people to ensure that it goes to the good of the American people.
I want to make sure you have a chance to make a closing statement, so you have about 30, 40 seconds. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. So again, I'm a teacher. I've been teaching 22 years, and one of the things I've taught my students American exceptionalism, that the world is far, far better off with a strong America, and I've taught them that our country is only as great as the people who occupy and inhabit the offices of our government. And so, more than anything, my hope is that I want to make public office accessible for everybody. Because if public office can be accessible for everybody, and then you combine that with representatives of the people who are deeply rooted and committed to the communities that they serve, to me, there's no stopping American exceptionalism if we get a diversity of outstanding candidates with the ability to really deeply care about the communities they serve.
Thank you, Mr. Young, for sharing your views with us. Viewers, please remember there is another candidate for the 6th Congressional District, Chrissy Houlihan. You can see both interviews on BCTV's website or YouTube page. To check your voting status, go to vote.pa.gov. You can register, change your party, locate your polling place, or apply for an absentee or mail-in ballot. The deadline to register is October 21st. The deadline to apply for mail-in is October 29th. Election day is November 5th. Please check the League's online voter's guide, vote411.org, to get more information on the candidates, as well as find these interviews. Thank you for watching Candidates Up Front. I'm Bill Litvin. Good day.